Well, I guess I am sorry, okay? I baited all of you. I lulled you into a false sense of security, so it is my fault. I peddled some lies. I swindled some false truth. What am I talking about exactly? So this week is the start of the third week of Mythic Raiding, the fourth week of Raiding as a whole, and the fifth week since 9.1 launched. We haven't talked about raids in a while. We're going to be looking a little bit of some of the changes Blizzard put in, what changed, but first, more importantly, we have the new affix combination for Mythic Plus. This is important because, as you know, we don't have a fixed schedule now. The affixes are getting all jumbled up compared to last season. They're getting new pairings for new weeks, so it's always new. You never know the schedule, you never know what's gonna come next week. So this week we have Bolstering with Quaking. And it's like, okay, fine. Quaking is easy, so put together with Bolstering, which is hard. We knew that sooner or later Bolstering was gonna come, so at the very least now it's with a simple one. Okay, that was the initial idea. However, when we went over previous weeks, trying to pinpoint which could have been the affixes being paired with which other affixes in this sort of who's who minigame, I pointed out, well, that's cool. We already have gotten out Necrotic, we already gotten out Spiteful and Inspiring, which are amongst the more nasty one to get, especially if you pair them with Bolstering. So we know that it's not going to come up with Bolstering, at least for the first week. We also know from the last week of the rotation of this season that was live on the PTR. It didn't make it live in the live version of the game, but it was Bolstering and Explosive, which is also cool. So Bolstering and Quaking was kind of good, but what differs here is that if you look carefully, if you squint your eyes and try to read properly, it says that Bolstering and Quaking are in the week of Fortified. So one man a couple of weeks ago told you, reassured you that, well, we don't know where the affixes are going to be put into, but certainly, Bolstering is not going to go in a Fortified week, right? Because Bolstering is just beefing up normal mobs a lot, and that's what Fortified does, so there's not going to be this double up on trash mob strength, of course. We've never gotten it, so, well, that was a lie. That was a lie because this week Bolstering has been moved over to Fortified for the first time, at least since the affixes work this way. And what is even more surprising is that we had, at the last week in the PTR, we had Bolstering in a Tyrannical week, and now we have it on a Fortified week. So either of two things. One, the last week of the PTR is not going to be the one that's going to come live, so instead it's going to be something entirely different, and Bolstering was already planned on being just on Fortified. Or number two, we can get different affixes in different weeks, even moving between Fortified and Tyrannical, which is not something we have seen before. We have seen affixes between last season and this season being moved, because, for example, Volcanic was in Fortified in Season 1, has been moved in Tyrannical in Season 2. Spiteful was in Fortified in Season 1, has been moved in Tyrannical in Season 2. Conversely, we have had Inspiring on Tyrannical being moved into Fortified, as well as Storming being on Tyrannical being moved onto Fortified. So we did have this type of changes. We knew they were possible. I just discounted Bolstering from possibly ever being paired with Fortified. So this week should be an interesting one. It should be an interesting one because, technically speaking, Bolstering and Quaking are pretty easy, and technically speaking, if you manage to get through the trash mobs smoothly, then you're going to have very easy bosses. There is basically nothing that is going to hinder you. Quaking is very, very minor when it comes to fighting bosses. You know, there are many other affixes from Necrotic, even Explosive can become pretty annoying during bosses, but not really Quaking. So bosses are going to be very simple, more so than what you were used to during previous Bolstering weeks, because Bolstering was always with Tyrannical. So you had this bitchy situation where not only did you have to struggle for trash mobs, because trash mobs were paired with Bolstering, so they just made it longer and more annoying to deal with, then you also had to deal with a Tyrannical buffed boss. Now, there's not going to be Tyrannical after the Bolstering part, so it's going to be much better to go through. Now, finishing our part about the affixes, because we have already gotten 10 different affixes this season, this is the 5th week, so we already gotten 10, now it means there is only 2 left. Now, this time, perhaps betrayed by my own hubris, I'm going to go ahead and straight up call what is going to be next week. Because, you know, there is 12 affixes in the game. The only 2 affixes that are left, and the only 2 affixes that we haven't seen yet. Come on, it's simple. Come on, the 2 ones you haven't seen yet. One is, of course, explosive, and the other one is sanguine. So, next week is going to be tyrannical, sanguine, and explosive. Particularly interesting because sanguine and explosive both are considered the simple ones, are considered the easy ones, generally speaking the ones you want next to a more annoying affix so you can make the week easier. Instead now they are paired together. So it's gonna be interesting to see how they're gonna end up being, especially also, of course, sanguine used to be in fortified, so next week it would mean it's on a tyrannical week, so there's another switch in affix positions. Now, off with the affixes for the day. Let's talk about a little bit for a second about Mythic Plus before we go over to the raid. I wanted to look for a second at the general population, what the general population has been doing, because the high keys, you know, the high level is still somewhat low, so to speak. You know, keys at the 22-ish level are the ones being pushed, so looking at keys higher than 20, you know, that there is still too little data to go through. You know, there is basically something like 100 people so far, so high, so yeah, you know, numbers will be very tiny and very skewed. Instead, looking at the majority of the population, I wanted to show that when it comes to tanks, there is a very clear, almost 50% different divide between 3 tanks and 3 other tanks. Now, we are playing a quiz and we are handing out points, so here's the question. Which are, in your opinion, the 3 tanks currently being all at about 20% representation each, 22 to 23, and then the 3 tanks that are being quite underplayed so far in Mythic Plus. Now, 2 of these are pretty simple to guess on the underplayed. Many of you will have probably said Protection Warrior. Yes, that would be a correct guess. It was a simple one. Some others would also have said probably Blood DK. You might have seen more Blood DK in the raid, but you're still like, yeah, but I don't really see them in Mythic Plus, so I think they are one of the tanks low. Which is also true, correct. Now, when you look at the popularity instead of tanks, you're like, well, of course, Vengeance Demon Hunter has to be high, because even though it might not be as popular as Season 1, I've still seen quite a few of them. I still see them being played, so there's no way they have dropped to being unpopular, which is true. And then Guardian Druid, right? Guardian Druid, I haven't seen them in raids, you know, they're not really being used, but I have seen Mythic Plus a bit, and I played Mythic Plus myself, and I have seen plenty of Guardian Druids, so it must be there. Which leaves us with Protection Paladin and Brewmaster Monk. That's kind of the surprising part, because, of course, Protection Paladin is still very popular. Protection Paladin has been amongst the most popular tanks overall since the start of this expansion, so it is Brewmaster Monk being very low, which is kind of surprising. Maybe not too much, but it's kind of surprising in the sense that Brewmaster has had historically more presence than Blood and Protection. It seems like they have gone a little bit more down, or more simply, more Prot Warriors and Blood DKs are playing. Healers do have a similar situation when it comes to Druids. Druid, much like Protection Paladin, is a very popular healer spec. They are having a pretty rough expansion. They are not popular or wanted in raids, and they are not popular or wanted in Mythic Plus, but this doesn't stop the majority of the population from trying to play them in Mythic Plus. So they have indeed been more popular than Holy Paladin in Mythic Plus for a long time. Of course, the higher you go in keys, the more popular Paladin will be, and the less popular Restoration Druid will be. Of course, none of this goes to touch Restoration Shaman, which remains the more overall popular healer spec in Mythic Plus. Now, not much to say about the melee DPS, because really nothing has changed. It's still Havoc being very popular. Warriors are gaining more and more in popularity. That's more or less the same we've always seen. What I wanted to go and look at instead is ranged, because we see, for the first time, an even fair fight between the 2 hunter specs, because the spec on the left, the one which is 0.1% above the other, is actually Beast Mastery. So, round of applause, because Beast Mastery for the first time is more popular than Marksmanship Hunter in this expansion. Now, hold on. It doesn't mean they're good. It doesn't mean they are wanted or that they are popular at high keys. Just that the general population is playing more Beast Mastery than Marksmanship by a very tiny margin, but they still are. Of course, when you go back to higher keys, there is still a slight advantage of Marksmanship, but remember the old days of Marksmanship being at 28% and Beast Mastery being at 2. Okay, long strides have been made since then in the fight for equality and equity between the two hunter specs. Not really much can be said about the equality of the other specs, you know. In this case, for Mage, it's Frost being the dominant one, and for Warlock is Destruction, changing from 9.0 and 9.0.5. Now we have to move. We have to do a flip and land in Raidland. Now, looking first at the participation, which is always very important, as opposed to the actual performance, because the logs are few, the bosses being cleared, so the logs available for the bosses are pretty few, so plenty is bound to change the more bosses are killed, but the population and the representation is more relevant. So the representation has remained, unsurprisingly, exactly the same in the top 5. It's still Balance, Destruction, Frost, Shadow, and Marksmanship. So 5 ranged specs. I kept going over how much more damage the melee DPS specs have been doing this tier, if this is the meta of the melee DPS, if they are way more performing, and yet the top 5 is still ranged. Now, to be fair, the gap is not as big as it used to be. We do have the big gap between Balance and everyone else, sure, and also a decent gap when it comes to Destruction and Frost, but after that it's very smooth in terms of representation. Shadow and Marksmanship are pretty close to Havoc, our first melee spec. Now, Arms is there together with Assassination. Arms has gained more ground compared to last week, compared to 8 days ago when we looked at this. Arms is gaining more ground, and it is also worth mentioning because Fury is being played less. Well, partially we can say, because Fury has lost some of the representation they had before, right? Arms Warrior, for example, has increased its representation by 8 times compared to 8 days ago, whereas Fury Warrior has only increased its representation by barely 3 times, right? So of course Fury grew much less than Arms. Not surprising. You can tell by the amount of growth in these 8 days that if there is some stagnation in some class and spec growth, or if there is some surge. Now, looking at the growth of the healers instead, we left the healers with Restoration Shaman unsurprisingly being at the top, followed by Holy Paladin, then Holy Priest, then Discipline, then Restoration Druid, and then Mistweaver. What exactly changed? Well, the answer is nothing. The answer is that Restoration Shaman and Holy Paladin were very close to each other, and then there was a big drop after those two. It has slightly increased, to be fair. Before, Holy Paladin was something like 7% behind Restoration Shaman. Now they are almost a full 10% behind, but that's very minor. And the gap is about the same. You know, before there were over 2 times, 2.3 times as many Holy Paladins that there were Holy Priests. Now it's about the same again. Over twice as much, a little bit more. Now, we still have to make the point every time when we mention priests that Holy and Discipline can still be the same. They don't have to necessarily be 2 completely different identities. They might just be one guy playing a different fight with a different spec, which means their numbers are going to be low because they have to split their time with the 2 specs, but if you combine them, they are much more represented than this looks. Of course, you don't have to be surprised. You don't have to be surprised that if you look at the top kills, when you look at the world first race, you've looked at a bunch of streams and you've seen everywhere Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest as their combo for healers. And then you see here and everywhere there is Restoration Shaman. That is just normal for high-end guilds. They are not suddenly going to bench all their shamans and start recruiting for Holy Paladins and Discipline Priests, because that's what the top guilds have done. The reason why the top guilds were using Holy and Discipline Priest is this graph right here, which is the damage they are doing. If you're bringing 4 of these, instead of bringing some extra shamans or maybe even Holy Priests, you are gaining some total of 4,000 to 5,000 DPS, which is half a DPS extra you can get, not to mention the actual burst being granted by Ashen Hallow. That is the extra benefit you can get by playing only damage dealing healers in, world first race contending guilds. The representation of tanks. We haven't gotten the full pass of Blood Decay, because when we looked at it the first time, we saw that Brewmaster was the far and ahead clear tank most used, but then below there was the growth of Blood Decay catching up to Vengeance and almost passing it. It's been 8 days, plenty more logs, yet Vengeance has been able to hold very tightly, very closely. Blood Decay is even closer than before, but Vengeance is still ahead. At this point, I do think eventually Blood Decay is going to surpass Vengeance. It's inevitable. Brewmaster is there because Mistweaver is dead, and because Windwalker is doing okay in the raid, but nothing special. So every time a raiding guild will need a monk debuff to put on the enemies, Brewmaster is always going to be there as a tank. Vengeance, as I pointed out multiple times already, is no longer needed because now Havoc is doing very well. So you're not forced to bring in a Vengeance Demon Hunter because the debuff, Chaos Brand, was it called, can be brought by a Havoc Demon Hunter. So no real need for Vengeance just because of that. Now you are more free of bringing other tanks that can bring you something more in the raid without having to go for Vengeance anymore. Now we can close this by looking at the actual damage, the damage numbers, okay? This is what we stopped last week at. The only difference between last week and this week is that, of course, more people got to kill the first 3 bosses again, and now we have enough logs to look at Ner'zhul. For comparison, if you go past Ner'zhul, so if you go at the 5th boss, so almost at half of the raid, just looking at the first 5, there is less than 200 logs for most of the specs. Only the more popular one are at over 200, and over 60% of the specs don't even break the 95 logs, so it's still very, very skewed. What we can see this week is something similar, with a few differences, than what we saw last week. You see that at the top there is Arms, there is Outlaw, there is Assassination, there is Windwalker, there is Havoc, there is Feral, Subtlety, Frost Decay, and Ret. Literally, nearly every single played melee DPS spec is at the top. Now, one might wonder, what is Affliction Warlock doing there? What's the deal? Well, Affliction Warlock has very, very few logs. Affliction Warlock is the second least played spec in all of raiding, only above, yeah, you guessed it, Survival Hunter. So it is very skewed. There are very, very few logs, and their damage numbers are being taken in percentages because of very few players getting very, very high logs, skewing the entire thing. Just to give you the example is this Madman on Ner'zhul. Latia, or Latia from Epoch, has 10,228 DPS on Ner'zhul, which is the 3rd highest DPS in the world. And because it's only one of literally 5 Affliction Warlocks in that fight, it makes it look like this, which gives Affliction Warlocks a much higher average than they normally would have. Now, again, as I pointed out, remember that when you have this few logs available for these few bosses, the damage profile of the bosses is going to be very important. So if you only have logs for 4 boss fights, Ner'zhul has a few adds spawning that you can cleave off of. You have the Eye of the Jailer, which has also an add that you can cleave off of, and then you have the 9, which have at least the first part of the fight with 2 targets, even up to 3 targets with the add that you can cleave off of. So certain specs can do much better in these fights because of the damage profile. Then, as we go deeper, you might fight against Raznal, which is much more single target oriented, Guardian of the First Ones, which is almost entirely single target oriented. So the overall damage numbers are going to skew based on the type of fight that people are going to keep killing, that more and more guilds are going to keep killing, so more and more logs are going to come in and change the way it works. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden Announcement Shaman and Survival Hunter at the bottom are going to surge at the top, but some of the specs in here are bound to fluctuate much more. Something like Ret Paladin, something like Elemental Shaman, something like Balanced Druid, of course, even Destruction Warlock are bound to go more up and down based on the type of the fight. So with this wise mention, we can close the video on the note of the addition, the hotfix from Blizzard, where Broker Kotul in the Great Vault room will now exchange excess anima for caches of trade skill goods, including Quartzite crystals. The developer's note was, of course, that as players have traversed the more anima-rich lands of Kortia, some players are finding that they no longer have new unlocks to spend it on. So, there we go. Now there is a vendor which is going to offer you a bunch of stuff for Anima. The stuff in question is the Cortex Crystal. You can only buy them in bulk of 5, so it's going to cost you 25,000 Anima, as well as the Heavy Callous Hide, which is going to be 10 of them, and then 20 Elithium Ores for 7,500 or 20 Lightless Silks for 7,500. It seems pretty pointless, to be fair. It's still better for you to just buy armor for Anima and then sell it for gold. That is actually still gonna be more profitable than doing this. So the prices, I feel, are gonna have to be changed a little bit if you want to make this worthwhile. Now we can stop here. We can stop here for the day. We will eventually go a little bit more in depth in both raids and Mythic Plus, but it's still very early, especially in the week for Mythic Plus, to go through this. So we're gonna have to wait a while. In the meantime, we can take a break. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, leave a like, a comment, perhaps even clicking on the subscribe button, or if it is of your preference, you might support me by giving me your cheat codes for the Great Vault. Anyone has any cheat code, please? Some guaranteed loot cheat code? No? No one? Okay, fine. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, no, but really though, if the Vault offers me one more fucking overflowing Anima Cage trinket, I'm gonna sue them. I'm gonna sue these fucking brokers and their crooked Great Vault.